When a group of racist bikers decides to attack an elderly black veteran, they have no idea that a staunch defender, a former military service dog, will stand in their way. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and post in the comments where you're watching this video from. The house sat on the edge of the forest, a modest, weather-beaten structure that had withstood decades of rain, wind, and neglect. Its peeling paint and sagging porch mirrored the life of its sole occupant, Lucas. The house wasn't much to look at, but it was enough for him. It kept the world at bay, and that was all he needed. Henry's days were simple and predictable, a routine meticulously crafted to keep the chaos of his mind in check. He rose at dawn, brewed his coffee in an old percolator that hissed and groaned like an arthritic companion, and sat on the porch, staring out at the woods. He never saw anyone, that was the point. The forest was his buffer, a wall between him and the rest of humanity. This morning was no different. The sun filtered through the dense canopy of trees, casting golden light onto the patchy lawn. Henry sipped his coffee slowly, his hand steady despite the years. His steel-gray hair was neatly combed, his face weathered but clean-shaven. Old habits die hard, he thought. Decades of military service had drilled discipline into his bones, even though those days were long behind him. As he sat, the silence was broken only by the occasional bird call or the distant rustle of leaves. Yet even in this peace, Henry couldn't escape the weight of his memories. They clung to him, heavy and persistent, like the damp air of the woods after a rainstorm. He remembered the screams, the smell of gunpowder, the faces of the friends he had buried. It was a past he didn't talk about, not because he was ashamed, but because there was no one to listen. After finishing his coffee, Henry stood and stretched, his joints creaking like old hinges. He moved with the stiffness of someone who had carried too much for too long. His day would follow the same script as always, tending to the small vegetable garden out back, repairing the porch railing that seemed to sag a little more each week, and tinkering in his shed. The shed was his sanctuary within a sanctuary, filled with tools and projects that gave his hands something to do when his mind grew restless. By mid-afternoon, Henry decided to make a rare trip into town. Supplies were running low, and while he hated leaving the safety of his home, he couldn't avoid it forever. He climbed into his old pickup truck, a relic of another era, and headed down the narrow dirt road that led to the main highway. The truck rattled and groaned much like its owner, but it got the job done. The town was small and unremarkable, with a single main street lined with shops that had seen better days. Henry parked in front of the general store, nodding curtly to the owner as he stepped inside. He moved quickly, gathering canned goods, coffee, and other essentials, keeping his head down to avoid any unnecessary interaction. People in town knew of him, but didn't know him. He was the quiet man who lived in the woods, and that was just fine with him. As he loaded his purchases into the truck, something caught his eye on the drive back. At first, it was just a dark shape on the side of the road, barely distinguishable from the surrounding brush. Henry slowed the truck and squinted, his sharp eyes picking out the outline of an animal lying in the dirt. Pulling over, he stepped out cautiously, his boots crunching on the gravel. The shape resolved into a dog, large, lean, and obviously injured. Its fur was matted with dirt and blood, and one of its legs was bent at an unnatural angle. The dog's eyes flickered open as Henry approached, dull with pain, but still alert. "Damn," Henry muttered under his breath. He crouched down, careful not to startle the animal. "What happened to you, boy?" The dog growled softly, a low warning rumble that spoke of both fear and exhaustion. Henry held his hands up in a gesture of peace. "Easy now. I'm not going to hurt you." For a moment they stared at each other, man and dog, both worn and wary. Henry could see the animal's ribs pressing against its skin, the evidence of a hard life etched into every inch of its body. Something about the dog struck a chord in him, a deep, familiar ache that he couldn't quite place. Henry hesitated. Taking the dog meant responsibility, a commitment he hadn't made to anyone or anything in years. But leaving it here to die slowly on the side of the road wasn't something he could bring himself to do. With a resigned sigh, he stood and fetched an old blanket from the truck. The dog didn't resist. As he wrapped it up, and gently lifted it into the passenger seat. It was too weak to fight, its head resting limply on the edge of the seat. Henry glanced at it as he started the engine. "Guess you're coming with me." The drive back to the house was quiet, the dog barely moving except to let out the occasional soft whine. Henry glanced over at it now and then, noting the scars that crisscrossed its body. This wasn't an ordinary stray. It had been through something violent, something that had left its mark, just like him. Back at the house, Henry carried the dog inside and laid it on an old quilt in the corner of the living room. He fetched a bowl of water and some scraps of food, setting them down within reach. The dog sniffed at the offerings but didn't eat. It simply lay there, its eyes following Henry's movements with a mix of caution and curiosity. As the day turned into night, Henry found himself sitting on the floor next to the dog, talking to it in a low, soothing voice. He didn't know why, maybe because it felt natural, or maybe because it was the first living thing he'd let into his life in years. "You've seen some things, haven't you?" he said, his hand resting lightly on the dog's uninjured side. "I know that look. I've seen it in the mirror." The dog didn't respond, of course, but its eyes seemed to soften just a little. Henry leaned back against the wall, letting the silence settle between them. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel so empty. Morning light filtered through the old curtains, casting soft beams across the living room. Henry woke with a stiff neck, still seated against the wall where he'd fallen asleep the night before. His eyes adjusted to the dim light, and he glanced over at the dog. It hadn't moved much during the night, but its breathing was steady. That was a good sign, he thought. Henry stood on his porch, the weight of the shotgun heavy in his hands, as the rumble of motorcycles grew closer, echoing through the forest and vibrating through the ground beneath his boots. The scene was almost surreal, the calm night shattered by the low growl of approaching engines. But Henry's mind was razor-sharp, focused on what was to come. At his side, Leo stood alert, his body tense, tail stiff, and ears perked forward. The dog was a picture of readiness, a kindred spirit who seemed to understand the gravity of the moment. Together they waited, two soldiers, one human, one canine prepared to defend their ground. Henry's thoughts drifted briefly to his past, to the battles he had fought and the comrades he had lost. This wasn't the same, but the stakes felt just as high. This was his home, his sanctuary, and he wasn't about to let it be taken from him. Leo growled low in his throat, his sharp eyes locked on the tree line where the faint glow of headlights began to appear. The motorcycles pulled into the clearing, their riders loud and brash, their laughter cutting through the stillness of the night. 5 men dismounted, their leather jackets glinting in the moonlight, patches emblazoned with symbols of aggression and dominance. They spread out casually, as if they owned the place, their voices carrying a tone of smug confidence. Henry stepped forward, his silhouette framed by the dim light spilling from the windows of the house. He didn't shout or threaten. He simply stood there, his presence alone enough to give pause. Leo moved with him, standing firm, his growl deepening as the men approached. "Look who decided to come out and play," the leader called, his voice dripping with mockery. He was the same man from the gas station, the one with the snake tattoo coiling around his neck. "You should have stayed inside, old man. Would have been easier for you." Henry's grip on the shotgun tightened, but he didn't raise it. "You've had your fun," he said evenly, his voice steady and firm. "It's time for you to leave." The leader laughed, a sharp, unpleasant sound. "And if we don't? What are you going to do about it?" Leo barked sharply, a single commanding sound that cut through the laughter. The men hesitated, their bravado faltering as they took in the sight of the dog at Henry's side, its sharp teeth bared and muscles coiled like a spring ready to snap. "You see my dog?" Henry asked, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable edge. "He's seen worse than you, so have I." The leader stepped forward, his sneer returning. "Big talk for someone outnumbered 5-1. Henry smirked, a cold, calculating expression. "Maybe, but I don't need numbers to deal with cowards." The words hit their mark, and the leader's face darkened with anger. He motioned to his men. Teach this old man a lesson." As they moved forward, the first tripwire was triggered, and a cacophony of noise erupted from the perimeter. Metal cans clanged and clattered, an ear-splitting racket that startled the bikers and sent Leo charging forward. The dog moved with precision and force, his instincts kicking in as he drove the men back. Henry stepped off the porch, the shotgun raised now, but he fired it into the air, a warning shot that froze the men in their tracks. "That's enough," he barked, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had seen combat. "Next one won't miss." The bikers looked at each other, the confidence they had arrived with now visibly shaken. Leo growled again, his sharp eyes daring them to make a move. The leader hesitated, weighing his options, before finally throwing up his hands in mock surrender. "All right, old man," he said, his voice laced with bitterness. "You win this round, but this isn't over." Henry lowered the shotgun, but kept his stance firm. "It is if you know what's good for you. Now get off my property." The men retreated to their motorcycles, grumbling among themselves as they started their engines. The roar of their departure filled the clearing, but Henry and Leo stood their ground until the sound faded into the distance. When the night was quiet once more, Henry let out a long breath, the tension in his body easing slightly. He knelt down beside Leo, ruffling the dog's fur. "Good boy," he said softly. "We did it." Leo leaned into his touch, his tail wagging faintly. For the first time in a long while, Henry felt a sense of pride, not just in what they had done, but in the bond they had formed. Together, they had faced the darkness and stood their ground, proving that even in the face of adversity, resilience and loyalty could prevail. As the stars glittered overhead and the forest settled back into its natural rhythm, Henry looked out into the night. He knew this might not be the end of the trouble, but he also knew that he and Leo were ready for whatever came next. Beside him, Leo stood alert, his ears erect, his eyes fixed on the direction of the approaching noise. Henry had prepared for this. He had spent days fortifying the property, using every bit of his training to make the house defensible. He knew that he couldn't take these men head-on. They had the numbers and the recklessness that came with knowing no one would stand in their way. But Henry had something they didn't: his experience, his instincts, and his determination not to let anyone bully him in his own home. As the first motorcycle rounded the bend in the road, Henry took a deep breath, steadying himself. He wasn't afraid, not in the way he'd been before. Now it was something different, a focused kind of intensity that narrowed his world down to the sounds of the engines, the figures dismounting from their bikes, and the shouts and laughter of the men as they gathered at the edge of his yard. There were 5 of them, the same group from the gas station. The leader, the one with the snake tattoo, swaggered forward, his eyes scanning the property. He seemed amused, as if the very idea of Henry putting up resistance was some kind of joke. He shouted to the others, his voice filled with mocking confidence. "Look at this place. I told you the old man was just sitting here waiting for us, probably scared out of his mind." He gestured toward the house, laughing. "Let's show him what happens when you mess with the wrong people." Henry watched as the men began to fan out, moving across the yard. One of them approached the shed, kicking at the door, while another moved along the side of the house, peering into the windows. The leader stood in the center of the yard, his arms crossed, a smirk on his face. And then the first trap was triggered. A loud clattering filled the air as one of the men tripped over a wire Henry had set a series of cans tied together that tumbled noisily across the ground. The biker let out a startled shout, stumbling backward, and Henry used the distraction to his advantage. He fired a warning shot into the air, the blast echoing through the night. "Get off my property!" Henry shouted, his voice carrying across the yard. He knew they wouldn't leave, not yet, but he wanted to make it clear that he wasn't going to be an easy target. The leader sneered, looking toward the porch. "You think you can scare us off with a shotgun, old man? You're outnumbered." Henry kept the gun raised, his eyes locked on the man. "You don't want to do this. I promise you." The leader laughed, waving his men forward. "Get him!" That was all the invitation they needed. The bikers moved in, spreading out as they approached the house. Henry took aim and fired again, this time hitting the ground in front of the nearest man. The biker cursed, diving for cover behind a tree. Leo, sensing the imminent danger, growled low in his throat, his muscles tensing as he waited for Henry's command. Henry moved quickly, retreating into the house and locking the door behind him. He knew they'd try to break in, and he was ready for it. He had blocked off the back entrance, leaving only one way for them to get in through the front, where he had set up a barricade and more traps. He could hear them outside, shouting to each other, their footsteps pounding on the porch. One of them kicked at the door, the wood rattling under the force. Henry took a deep breath, steadying his hands. This was just like before, like the times he'd spent in the service barricaded in a house, waiting for the enemy to make their move. Only this time, he wasn't protecting anyone but himself and Leo. The door splintered as one of the bikers kicked it open, and Henry fired again, the blast sending wood flying. The man fell back with a shout, clutching his arm. Another one tried to force his way in, but Leo lunged, his powerful jaws clamping down on the man's leg. The biker screamed, struggling to shake the dog off, but Leo held on, his growl deep and fierce. Henry moved with purpose, his training kicking in as he used the chaos to his advantage. He fired another shot, forcing the remaining men to scatter. Leo released his grip, backing up to Henry's side, his eyes blazing with determination. The leader, seeing his men faltering, let out an enraged shout. He pulled a gun from his belt, aiming it toward the house. Henry barely had time to react, diving behind the couch as a shot rang out, shattering a window. Glass rained down, the sharp shards cutting into Henry's arm, but he ignored the pain, his focus entirely on the men outside. He knew they wouldn't stop. They were too far gone, too drunk on their own power and rage to back down now. Henry had seen that look before on the battlefield, in the eyes of men who had nothing left to lose. He knew what it meant. The leader moved toward the house, his gun raised, but before he could fire again, Leo lunged at him, his teeth bared. The force of the attack knocked the man off balance, and they tumbled to the ground, Leo's growl echoing through the night. The man struggled, trying to bring the gun around, but Leo was too fast, his jaws closing around the man's wrist. Henry rose, his heart pounding as he moved toward them. He knew he had to end this now, before anyone else got hurt. He grabbed the leader's arm, twisting it until the gun fell from his grip. Leo released his hold, stepping back, his teeth bared, his eyes never leaving the man. Henry stood over the leader, his chest heaving, the shotgun still in his hands. The man looked up at him, his face twisted in pain and fury. You think this is over?" he spat, his voice filled with venom. "You'll regret this, old man." Henry shook his head, his eyes hard. "No, you're the one who's going to regret it." He didn't need to say more. The leader knew he'd lost. He struggled to his feet, glaring at Henry before turning and stumbling toward his bike. The others followed, their confidence shattered, their eyes filled with fear and anger. They mounted their motorcycles, the engines roaring to life as they sped away, their taunts and threats fading into the night. Henry watched them go, his body trembling from the adrenaline. He looked down at Leo, who stood beside him, his fur bristling, his eyes still alert. Henry knelt, resting a hand on the dog's head. "Good boy," he said, his voice rough. "You did good." Leo's tail wagged slightly and he licked Henry's hand, the tension slowly leaving his body. Henry took a deep breath, looking around at the damage, the broken door, the shattered window, the splintered wood. It was a mess, but they were alive. They had fought back, and they had won. The sound of approaching sirens broke the silence, the flashing lights of a police car cutting through the darkness. Henry sighed, standing and lowering the shotgun. The cavalry had finally arrived too late to make a difference. He walked to the front of the house, Leo at his side, and waited as the car pulled up, 2 officers stepping out. They looked at Henry, at the damage, and then at each other, their expressions a mix of shock and confusion. One of them, a young man with a concerned face, approached cautiously. "Sir, are you all right?" Henry nodded, his face grim. "We're fine, just a little trouble." The officer looked at Leo, who was still standing at attention, his eyes wary. He nodded slowly. "Looks like you handled it." Henry didn't answer. He simply looked out into the darkness where the bikers had disappeared, his expression unreadable. The fight was over. But he knew that this wasn't the end. Men like that didn't just go away. They'd be back eventually, and when they did, Henry would be ready. For now, though, he was grateful for the quiet. He looked down at Leo, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Come on, boy," he said softly. "Let's get this place cleaned up." Together they turned and walked back into the house, leaving the chaos of the night behind them. The porch light flickered, casting a dim glow over the yard. And for the first time in a long time, Henry felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. It was a small thing, fragile and fleeting, but it was enough to keep him going. And as long as he had Leo by his side, he knew they could face whatever came next. The morning sun filtered weakly through the broken windows, casting long shadows across the disheveled living room. The night's chaos had left its mark. Shattered glass lay scattered across the floor, splintered wood from the broken door lay in piles, and the acrid scent of spent gunpowder hung in the air. Henry stood in the center of it all, surveying the damage, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion. Leo sat nearby, his gaze fixed on Henry as if waiting for a command. The adrenaline of the previous night had worn off, leaving behind a dull ache in Henry's body, a reminder that he was no longer the young soldier he used to be. He reached down and patted Leo's head, giving the dog a tired smile. "You're one tough son of a gun, you know that?" Leo wagged his tail, his ears perking up slightly at Henry's voice. The police had left hours ago after taking statements and asking questions that Henry could barely focus on. They had offered to take him to the hospital, but he had refused. He'd been through worse. What mattered most was that they had survived. The bikers had been chased off, and for the moment at least, the threat had passed. But as he looked around at the damage, Henry knew that the fight had left more than just physical scars. It had torn open old wounds, memories of battles fought long ago, of friends lost, of the constant struggle to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. He had thought he could leave all of that behind, but it seemed that life had other plans. He moved slowly, picking up the pieces of what the bikers had left behind. Leo followed him as he worked, his eyes always on Henry, as if sensing the heaviness that weighed on his master. Together, they began the task of repairing the house, sweeping up glass, boarding up the broken windows, and setting the door back on its hinges. By midday, Henry paused, his hands resting on the edge of the kitchen counter. He looked down at his hands that had once held rifles, that had once pulled comrades from the line of fire. Now they were calloused and worn from years of solitude, but they still remembered how to fight when it mattered. He glanced at Leo, who had settled near the doorway, his head resting on his paws, his eyes half closed. "Guess we make a good team, don't we?" Henry said softly. Leo lifted his head, his tail thumping against the floor in response. As the sun climbed higher, Henry decided to take a break. He made himself a pot of coffee, strong, black, the kind that cleared the fog from his mind. He poured a bowl of water for Leo, who drank eagerly before lying back down, his ears twitching at the slightest sound. Even in the quiet of the day, they both knew that peace was fleeting. Temporary, Henry walked to the porch, his coffee in hand, and sat down on the old wooden chair, the boards creaking under his weight. The yard was littered with signs of the previous night's struggle: tire tracks, trampled grass, the remnants of the traps he'd set. But beyond that, the world was beautiful. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves rustling softly. Birds called to each other, their songs a stark contrast to the violence of the night before. As Henry sat there, lost in thought, he heard the sound of a car approaching. He tensed instinctively, his eyes narrowing as he looked down the driveway. It wasn't the roar of motorcycles, but the low hum of a police cruiser. Henry watched as it pulled up, and a young officer stepped out. It was the same officer who had been there the night before, the one who had looked at Henry with a mix of concern and admiration. The officer walked up the steps, nodding to Henry. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, his voice respectful. "I wanted to check in, see how you're holding up." Henry took a sip of his coffee, nodding slowly. "We're all right. Just trying to get things back in order." The officer glanced around, his eyes lingering on the broken windows and the boarded-up door. "Looks like you had a hell of a night." Henry gave a dry chuckle, his eyes meeting the officer's. You could say that. The officer hesitated, then spoke again, his tone softer. I'm a veteran too, you know, Army. Did a couple of tours overseas before I came back and joined the force. He paused, looking down at his boots before continuing. When I heard what happened out here, well, I thought maybe you could use some help. Henry studied the young man for a moment, his expression unreadable. He saw the earnestness in his eyes, the way he held himself straight-backed with a quiet sense of purpose. He reminded Henry of himself a long time ago, before the weight of everything he'd seen had settled into his bones. After a moment, Henry nodded. Appreciate it, he said, but we're managing. The officer nodded, though he didn't seem convinced. He glanced at Leo, who was watching him warily from the doorway. That's some dog you've got there. He did a good job last night. Henry looked at Leo, a hint of pride in his eyes. Yeah, he's something special. The officer shifted on his feet, then reached into his pocket, pulling out a card. He held it out to Henry. Look, I know you're used to handling things on your own, but if you ever need anything backup, supplies, just someone to talk to, you give me a call. We veterans have to stick together, right? Henry took the card, his eyes flicking over it before he slipped it into his pocket. Thanks. I'll keep that in mind. The officer nodded, then gave a small salute before turning and walking back to his car. Henry watched as he drove away, the sound of the engine fading into the distance. He looked down at the card in his pocket, his fingers tracing the edges. It had been a long time since anyone had offered him help, longer still, since he'd considered accepting it. Later that afternoon, as Henry worked to repair the damage, a neighbor walked over from the property next door. It was Mrs. Matilda, a widowed woman in her 60s who had lived there as long as Henry could remember. She had always kept to herself, much like Henry, but now she stood at the edge of the yard, her eyes wide as she took in the sight of the damaged house. Henry, she called, her voice tinged with worry. I heard what happened. Are you all right? Henry straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. We're fine, Mrs. Matilda. Just some trouble that got a little out of hand. She stepped closer, her eyes softening as she looked at him. I brought some food. Thought you might need a little extra, given everything. She held up a covered dish, her hands trembling slightly. Henry hesitated, then walked over and took the dish from her, giving her a nod. Thank you. That's very kind. Mrs. Matilda looked at Leo, who had come to stand beside Henry, his eyes wary. And this must be the brave dog everyone's been talking about. She smiled, her expression gentle. He looks like a real hero. Henry looked down at Leo, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. He is. Saved my life more than once. Keep. Matilda reached out, her fingers brushing Leo's head. The dog leaned into the touch, his eyes softening. You two take care of each other, all right? She said, her voice quiet. If you need anything, you know where I am. Henry nodded, watching as she turned and walked back to her house. He looked down at Leo, who wagged his tail, his eyes full of loyalty and trust. Guess we're not as alone as we thought, huh, boy? As the day drew to a close, Henry sat down on the porch, Leo at his side. The world around them was slowly settling back into its usual rhythm, the birds singing, the wind rustling the leaves. But something had changed. Henry felt it deep in his bones, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to face everything alone anymore. He looked out at the yard, the fading sunlight casting long shadows across the grass. The fight with the bikers had left its mark, but it had also shown him something important, that he was still capable of standing up, of protecting what mattered. And in doing so, he had found something he hadn't realized he was missing, a sense of purpose, a reason to keep going. He reached down, scratching behind Leo's ears. The dog leaned into his hand, his eyes closing as he let out a contented sigh. We're going to be all right, Leo, Henry said softly, his voice filled with quiet determination. No matter what comes next, we're going to be all right. And for the first time in a long time, Henry believed it. The battle wasn't over. There would always be challenges, always be threats, but he knew he wasn't facing them alone. With Leo by his side, and maybe even a few new allies, he felt ready for whatever lay ahead. Henry looked down at Leo, who was watching them with bright eyes. The dog seemed to sense the importance of the moment, his tail wagging slightly as he looked from Henry to the officer. Henry let out a slow breath, then nodded. "All right, I'll think about it." The officer smiled, his relief evident. "That's all I ask. We're meeting next Saturday over at the VFW hall. I'll leave you the address." He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket, setting it on the table. "Hope to see you there." After the officer left, Henry sat down in his chair by the fire, staring at the piece of paper on the table. Leo came over, resting his head on Henry's knee, his eyes soft and questioning. Henry scratched behind his ears, a small smile tugging at his lips. "What do you think, boy? You think we ought to give it a shot?" Leo let out a soft woof, his tail thumping against the floor. Henry chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, I thought you might say that." The days passed, and Henry found himself thinking more and more about the officer's offer. There was a part of him that was scared of opening himself up, of being vulnerable in front of others who might see through the tough exterior he had built. But there was another part of him, a part that had grown since Leo had come into his life, that was curious. Maybe he could be part of something again. Maybe he could make a difference. Saturday came, and Henry found himself standing in front of his closet, looking at the old clothes hanging there. He pulled out a shirt, one of the few that didn't have holes or stains, and put it on. Leo watched from the doorway, his head tilted, as if wondering what Henry was doing. "Come on, boy," Henry said, grabbing his keys. "We're going for a drive." The VFW hall was a modest building with a faded sign and a small parking lot. Henry parked the truck and sat there for a moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel. Leo was in the passenger seat, his head up, his ears perked. He looked at Henry, then at the building, as if urging him on. Henry took a deep breath, then opened the door. "All right, let's do this." Inside, the hall was filled with the sounds of conversation and laughter. There were men and women of all ages, some in wheelchairs, others standing in small groups, talking and sharing stories. The officer from before saw Henry and waved him over, a wide smile on his face. "Mr. Caldwell, glad you could make it." He gestured to the group. "Everyone, this is Henry. He's a veteran like us. And that's Leo," he added, nodding to the dog. Leo sniffed at the people who reached out to pet him, his tail wagging as he moved through the group. Henry stood there, feeling a bit out of place. But then a woman in her 50s stepped forward, holding out her hand. "Nice to meet you, Henry. I'm Zara, Army medic, 89 to 93. Her eyes were kind, her smile genuine. Henry shook her hand, his own grip firm. "Lucas, infantry, a long time ago." Zara smiled, nodding. "Well, you're in good company here. We've all got our stories." As the afternoon wore on, Henry found himself relaxing. He listened as the others shared their experiences, their struggles, and their triumphs. There was something comforting about being surrounded by people who understood, who had been through the same things, who knew what it was like to carry the weight of memories that never quite faded. Leo was a hit, moving from person to person, accepting pets and scratches with a wag of his tail. He seemed to know that he was among friends, his body language relaxed and at ease. Henry watched him, a smile tugging at his lips. Leo had always been a good judge of character. By the time the meeting wrapped up, Henry felt lighter somehow, as if a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying had been lifted. The officer came over, clapping him on the shoulder. "What do you think, Henry? Not so bad, right?" Henry nodded, his smile genuine. "Not bad at all. I think I might come back." The officer grinned. "Glad to hear it. We could use a guy like you." As Henry and Leo walked back to the truck, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. Henry looked down at Leo, who trotted happily beside him, his tail wagging. "We did all right today, didn't we, boy?" Henry said, his voice filled with a quiet sense of pride. Leo barked softly, his eyes shining as he looked up at Henry. It wasn't just a bark, it was an affirmation, a promise that they were in this together. When they got home, Henry sat on the porch, Leo at his feet, watching as the stars began to appear in the sky. For the first time in a long time, Henry felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He wasn't alone anymore. He had Leo, and now he had a group of people who understood him, who welcomed him. It was a new beginning, a new purpose, and for that, Henry was grateful. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew he could face them. He had found something worth fighting for again, a community, a sense of belonging, and as long as Leo was by his side, Henry knew he could face anything that came their way. The night was quiet, the air cool against his skin. Henry looked down at Leo, his heart swelling with gratitude and love for the dog who had brought him back to life. "We're going to be all right, Leo," Henry said softly. "No matter what comes, we'll face it together."